I'm Desmond Woods. I'm a former serving RAN officer, and Jennifer and I are both on the council of the Australian Naval Institute. But that's where the similarity ends, because Jennifer's expertise is quite extraordinary. She is currently an expert associate at the National Security College, ANU, and an adjunct fellow in naval studies at the University of New South Wales. Jennifer hosts and produces the Australian Naval Institute's Saltwater Strategist podcast, which I recommend to all of you, focused on Indo-Pacific maritime affairs. She's published in a number of major newspapers. She's regularly on television and on radio and in international print and digital media. She served for more than 20 years in the RAN, specializing as a principal warfare officer, including undertaking deep specialist training with the Royal Navy in anti-submarine warfare. And she's extensive operational experience from the Middle East to the Caribbean and many other places in between. She's undertaken a series of naval appointments nationally and internationally in areas including force design strategy, career management, international exercise planning and operations. And that included a period of time serving as an exchange officer with the Royal Navy. Her last appointment in the RAN was as Director of Operations in Bahrain of the Combined Maritime Forces. That's a 38-nation coalition promoting national security in the Middle East and the Indian Ocean region, much in the news at the moment. So to summarize, Jennifer's expertise is in defense policy, military strategy, operations, force design, maritime security, international maritime law, specifically law of the sea and the law of naval warfare. And she's been admitted to the ACT Supreme Court as a practitioner and is currently undertaking a doctorate researching Australian maritime strategy at the University of Wollongong. That's the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security, ANCORS. So Jennifer's here with us tonight, very timely, to unpack the recent Surface Combatant Fleet Review decision, which will expand the size of the RAN, detailing both the future of our Navy and its future naval warfare capability. Jennifer, over to you.
Well, thank you. Thanks, everybody. It's obviously very awkward when somebody reads your bio. I feel like I'm retiring, but thank you so much, Desmond. And it's a real privilege to be here with you. You've taught me naval history. Please don't ask me any questions because you might be embarrassed.
Hell of a long time ago.
It was a long time ago. Yes, I'm showing my age. But look, thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm going to talk to you, as Desmond mentioned, about the expansion of the Royal Australian Navy and focus predominantly on the Surface Combatant Fleet announcement. So what is the $11 billion over the next 10 years all about? And why do we need it? And why does the Ukrainian development of uncrewed surface vessels not mean that we don't need surface ships, which I know was in the media a lot when the announcement came out. So happy to talk through that. So I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, then allow 30 minutes for questions. I won't talk predominantly about AUKUS, but happy to take questions on AUKUS. Also happy to discuss, what's happened over the weekend in the South China Sea, what that means in terms of the, bullying behavior from China to Philippines in the West Philippine Sea. So happy to talk about a bunch of things. So next slide, please. So I guess in terms of this presentation, though, I'm going to talk about a few things. One, quickly, why do we need a Navy? And this comes up all the time. Now, for somebody who grew up in Broken Hill, I probably would have asked that question until I was 16 and I signed on the dotted line to join the Navy. I got a big surprise about the taste of salt water, by the way. It wasn't something I was familiar with. And then now, having served in the Navy, it's surprising to me that people ask that question, but it is a pretty valid question. Or why do we need surface ships? Why can't submarines do it? Or with no disrespect, if you're here, why can't we just have small uncrewed surface vessels that do it all? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. How is the Navy expanding? Because it's not just expanding in terms of ships. Obviously, there is the AUKUS decision, but it's also expanding in terms of workforce, and it's finding that quite challenging. How did we get here? How did we get to the point that we need to double the size of the Navy Surface Combatant Fleet? And in fact, how do we get to the point that although we're increasing the size, between now and the late 20s, we're actually reducing the size, which is a significant risk and one that we tend to gloss over when we talk about the announcements. What were those outcomes of the Surface Combatant Fleet Review? Some of the criticisms and challenges to do with the review and some wider strategy considerations. And hopefully I will get through all of that in 30 minutes and then we can have a discussion about whatever you would like to discuss. Interestingly, the picture on the slide there is actually the Russian corvette, the Ivanovets. that was sunk by 6 uncrewed surface vessels in the Black Sea on the 1st of February this year. And it is really significant. It also really didn't have the capability to defend itself. So we can talk about that too. Right, so I guess why do we need a Navy? So you can't talk about maritime security or about the maritime domain for Australia without quoting some facts and figures. Oh, sorry. I'll get better at that, I promise. There's a lot of figures on that stream. The one thing I want to draw your attention to is a quote from Alpha Thea Mahan, who was a US naval strategist about 120, 130 years ago. And he said, wars are won by the economic strangulation of the enemy from the sea. And that's kind of doubly important for an island nation, right? And we are an island nation. We may not always grapple with that when we think about our military history, we may not think about the Navy, but we are an island nation. In terms of our trade, 98%, 99%, depending on how you quote, of our maritime trade by volume comes through the maritime domain, right? 91% of our fuel in 2023, and it probably hasn't changed, was in fact imported. Right, so when you think about, some of the arguments for why we don't need the surface combatants and why we should create a defensive bubble around Australia and we'll be good, well, they kind of come undone when you think about, okay, so that defensive bubble involves flying F-35s, okay, which are fighter jets. Where does that fuel come from? Oh, we don't produce any of that fuel in Australia. Right, so we need to protect our sea lines of communication. For me, that becomes a pretty simple discussion. 99% of our internet comes on our submarine cables. And I think that's something I'll get back to when I talk about what is our maritime strategy, because although we're investing in submarines, we're investing in surface ships, how are we actually protecting our underwater cables, which has become a significant issue in Europe and in fact in the Red Sea. It was an accident in the Red Sea and we can get into that, but either way, we need to be able to protect them. Next slide, please. So how is the Navy expanding? So it's expanding in 3 key ways. It is expanding the surface combatant fleet, as you saw announced nearly 4 weeks ago. It's expanding its workforce as well. So in 2022, it doesn't seem to get much press, but the previous government actually announced the expansion of the Department of Defence by 30%. Now, if you do the numbers, it's actually 20%, and I wrote the talking points for that. It said 20%, somebody changed it. It now says 30%. But either way, the Department of Defence is expanding by 2040. The Navy is expanding from 15,000, which it is now, give or take, depending on the recruiting day, to 20,000 by 2040, right? And that probably isn't enough to support all of the capabilities that we're bringing online. AUKUS, obviously you would have heard a lot about AUKUS. We are expanding our submarine capability and we are getting a more technical submarine capability. We're also expanding in terms of the support that we need to provide to UK and US personnel. Not a lot of information about phase 1 of AUKUS, which is the Submarine Rotation Force West. So from 2027, we will see UK and US submarines not basing, because you can't use the term basing, but pretty much basing out of HMAS Sterling. And we'll have a significant number of US and UK personnel that will be based there. Don't use the term basing. And that's why, in fact, you saw last week the Status of Forces Agreement signed between Australia and the UK. Right? It's not a treaty. It's not like it is a treaty. It's not like the ANZUS treaty. It's not a mutual defence treaty, but it is something that agrees how we deal with their large numbers of personnel that will increasingly be working in Australia. Now, I have structure on there and I have it in red because I think this is one of our problems. The Navy expanding, the Department of Defence is expanding. We're getting more people, we're getting more ships, we're getting more submarines. But when have we looked at our structure? We have an organisation that is designed for a peacetime organisation. We are in peacetime, but we are in a very different peacetime to where we were 25 years ago. And we've talked about all of these expansions, but we haven't actually looked at, is the current structure appropriate? So I think that's one of our gaps. Right, so I will improve, I promise. So how did we get to where we are with the surface ships? So I mentioned the 3 ways we're expanding. I'm really going to focus in on the surface combatant fleet review. Some people will say, the DSR looked at it and said the Navy didn't have enough ships and that's why we did a review. Well, it's not quite that simple. Now, a little bit of embarrassing self-promotion, but there is a report on the screen that I released with ASPI last year looking at Australia's maritime strategy and what kind of surface combatants we would need. And when you go back and look at the last 50 years of reviews, the last 50 years of reviews, before we talked about this removal of strategic warning time in the current geopolitical circumstances, every single one said we needed between 16 and 20 major surface combatants. Major surface combatants are your frigates or your destroyers, your offensive and your defensive ships. Every single white paper, except for the 87 white paper, said, oh no, you only need 11 to 12. And interestingly, the DIB review in 86 and the white paper in 87, they said, we can't work out why Australia is obsessed with the fact that it needs 11 or 12 major surface combatants. There's no strategic rationale. They need more, right? And when you think about those figures I put on the screen in terms of how dependent we are on trade, one that I didn't read out, that 1/10 of the world's surface is our search and rescue region, you can see why that maths makes sense. And did make sense even before we talk about the current geopolitical circumstances. Now, 2009 white paper actually tried to look at recapitalising the Navy. It wasn't giving it the expansion that we necessarily wanted, but it was trying to replace the ageing Anzacs. So the surface combatant fleet at the moment, so the offensive and defensive ships, is made up of 8 Anzacs and 3 Hobart-class destroyers, right? So frigates and destroyers. The Anzacs started commissioning in the mid-90s, and they're getting pretty old. So, your average frigate should have a service life of about 20 years. 2009, we said we needed to replace them. The money never came, global financial crisis, et cetera. A decision to replace them was not actually made until 2018, 9 years later. And when that decision was made, we said, oh, but that's okay, we'll extend the Anzacs. And interestingly, in 2019, an ANAO audit came out and said, you can't extend those ships 9 years. They are old, they are broken, you've sent them down to the Southern Ocean to chase Patagonian toothfish stealers, illegal fishers. They're not made for that. They're not going to last 9 years. But we persisted with this plan of, no, we're going to extend them 9 years. The hunters will come in the 2030s. Lo and behold, we've actually just decommissioned one immediately because you can't extend them 9 years. 2020, we had the Defence Strategic Update that said, hey, this concept of 10-year strategic warning time. So 10-year strategic warning time is kind of a force design concept that says, we'll have 10 years notice of a potential conflict in the region or a country getting a capability that could challenge us to really fix whatever we need to fix, capability, personnel, etc. 2020 should have been a watershed moment. It probably came too late saying, hey, we don't have 10 years strategic warning time. This is a fallacy. But yet we didn't change the structure of the surface combatant fleet. We were still going with 12 ships. So we currently have 11. We were going to replace the Anzacs with the hunters. We're going to get 1 extra, and we would have 12 by about 2040. But we knew from all of our analysis for 50 years that was never enough, right? So we always knew we had an issue and we parked it. Along this journey, there was an unfortunate ANAO audit report for defence that came out in 2023 that said, your Hunter-class frigate project, the costs have ballooned. So I can't remember what the original figures were going to be, right? And if you work at BAE, then I apologise if I get it wrong. But, say it was $35 billion. Well, by the ANAO audit report, it was $45 billion for 9 frigates and probably going to be more. Now, when the government announced the surface combatant fleet review, they said it's $65 billion. I don't know, that seems a little bit convenient that it jumped $20 billion just as you're reducing the program. But the costs were ballooning. So we know that our Anzac class aren't going to last the distance. We know that the Hunter class project is running off the rails. We know that we haven't got enough ships. We've always known that. And so we come to the 2023 April Defence Strategic Review, right? Defence Strategic Review. I'm impressed with my PowerPoint. Oh, sorry, next slide. Yeah. I'm impressed with my PowerPoint injury on this. So what did the Defence Strategic Review say? Well, the Defence Strategic Review effectively looked at the Navy and said, your Navy is not big enough. Your Navy is not lethal enough. We need to look at the surface combatant structure. Now, unfortunately, the Defence Strategic Review only talked about, really, from a maritime domain perspective, submarines, surface combatant ships, missiles, and some littoral stuff for Army, which the maritime domain capabilities that a country like Australia needs to protect things like, underwater cables, for example, is much more vast than that. But that's what it talked about. And in fact, there was a line from the Defence Minister that said, oh, now we're getting nuclear submarines. We need to rethink the surface fleet. That's made up. Those two things are really not related whatsoever. But anyway, he did say that. And it's embarrassing when you hear naval officers repeat that, right? Because it doesn't make sense. A nuclear submarine, great capability. It's literally just faster. It can stay submerged longer and it has more power. It doesn't fundamentally change the capability your Navy has. It just has a better version. Hopefully I explained that well. Anyway, so Defence Strategic Review said we need to fix the Navy, but we haven't had time to do it in the 8 months that you've given us to do the review. So there was an independent analysis team stood up who had 5 months to look at what is the structure of the surface combatant fleet. One of the problems with that review is that the terms of reference were very, very specific. So when you think about the Navy structure, you have surface combatants, you have oilers that give them fuel and ammunition, food, you have mine hunters that hunt mines, you have hydrographic ships that do your oceanography, you have a bunch of other capabilities that all come together, amphibious capabilities, to provide your maritime effects. But we only looked at a subset, which I think will bring us undone in the future. Next slide, I got it. Right, so surface combatant fleet review. So we know that we've always had a Navy that wasn't fit for purpose, and we can't have accepted that risk. We know that the DSR said you can't accept that risk anymore. We need to fix the structure of the surface combatant fleet, but we can't solve it. So we had a review team go away, controversially for some, headed by a US admiral, not an Australian admiral, US admiral with exceptional credentials, but still it didn't look great politically. Went away for 5 months and said, okay, what is the structure of the surface combatant fleet? What do we need? They delivered their outcomes to government at the end of September last year. And then 4 months later, the government made that public. So what were those outcomes? So the first one, so I said to you that right now we have 8 Anzac class and 3 Hobart class, so 8 frigates, 3 destroyers. It said, right, we're going to keep the Hobart class destroyers. Tick, we knew that, they're pretty good capability. The future Hunter class frigates, which, you know, there's a bunch of ANAO audit reports about that said those projects weren't going very well. Instead of getting the 9 to replace the 8 Anzacs you currently have, we're only going to get 6. Now, they didn't exactly say why, except potentially cost blowouts, but one of the criticisms of the Hunter class frigate for many is that it is a 10,000 ton frigate. So your average frigate is about 4,000 to 5,000 tons. So in the hierarchy of ships, you have patrol boats, corvettes, frigates, destroyers, cruisers, generally, right? Except for Australia, our destroyer is 7,200 tons, and our new frigate is 10,000 tons, which is the size of your average cruiser. It's bigger than a US Arleigh Burke destroyer that has 96 VLS cells for launching missiles, but it only has 32 VLS cells for launching missiles. Now, one of the reasons that it was so big, or certainly as said by the designers, is because it is orientated towards anti-submarine warfare. It does have a tow array capability, so a thing you tow behind the ship to detect submarines that is unlike any capability we have ever operated, right? It is very good capability. I'm lucky I operated it when I was in the UK. So that is a great ASW capability. They're also bolting on an Australian radar. So that's how we get to 10,000 tons with limited firepower. But when you think about the Defence Strategic Review that said we need to enhance our lethality, read more missiles to sea, although that's not what lethality necessarily is, but that's how it's being interpreted, the Hunter class get reduced to 6. Then, and to a surprise to many, it was a surprise to me, so I mentioned my report last year that I wrote, and I said, look, we've talked about this for 50 years. We really do need between 16 and 20 surface combatants. Everybody said to me, there's absolutely no way that's getting approved, especially because of AUKUS. You're absolutely dreaming. And I thought, yeah, I probably am too, but it makes sense, right? Anyway, much to everyone's surprise, much to my delight, because when you do the numbers, it kind of matches my report. The government came out and said, we're actually going to get 11 general purpose frigates. Unlike the Hunter class frigate, which is 10,000 tons, size of a cruiser, these are going to be, you know, anywhere between 3,500 to 5,500 tons. So a normal general purpose frigate. They will be able to do anti-submarine warfare, anti-air warfare, anti-ship missile defense, anti-surface warfare, the whole spectrum. And that's what general purpose means. It can operate across all those different spheres of warfare. Controversially, for some, they said, but the first 3 of these are going to be built overseas, commencing from the late 20s. And then the last 8 will be built in Henderson. Now, for anyone that looks at our geostrategic situation and, you know, the state of the Navy in terms of capability, that makes sense, right? Let's get them as fast as we can. But there are a lot of people who said, hang on, we're not investing in shipbuilding. Now, when you take into account AUKUS, you take into account the destroyer that will replace the Hobart, the evolved Cape-class patrol boats, the Oslo building, the new Army amphibious ships, whatever they're going to be, we're actually still doing a lot of shipbuilding, and more than we have done since probably, and you're the historian, just before World War II, right? So we'll get 3 general purpose frigates between kind of 2029, 2032, and then we'll start building the rest of the 8. Now, what that frigate is, we don't know. And there's one of the criticisms of the fleet review is that after an 8-month DSR, a 5 months review of ships specifically, 4 months of government considering it, so 17 months to tell us something that we already knew since the 1970s, we didn't actually select what type of frigate that's going to be, and that's going to be another 12 months. Yeah. Right? So that has been a key criticism. Some people say, no, that's just how we have to do it. We have to go to tender. But either way, there's another 12 months that we're going to wait. The next thing that came out, which was really interesting, is the selection of 6, what we're calling optionally crewed surface vessels. Now, these things don't actually exist, but the US has a program for a large uncrewed surface vessel. So when we say large, read something between kind of 1,600 to 2,000, 2,500 tons. Now, they have a plan to try and get something in the water by next year. Not clear if they're on track. They probably aren't, because they have a lot of shipbuilding problems as well. And so we're kind of jumping on the back of that program. Now, we're calling it optionally crewed, not uncrewed. The US's plan is that first couple will be optionally crewed, so you'll have some crew to do some maintenance, etc., and test and evaluation, but after that, they'll be uncrewed. So by the time we get this capability, which we're going to build in Henderson as well, from the mid-30s, to be honest, it won't make sense to optionally crew it. If the US have managed to perfect this technology and they've managed to meet their timelines, by the time we're entering into it, you won't have people on board. And when you're designing uncrewed capabilities, that makes sense, because the more you have to provide quality of life services for people to be on board, the bigger it gets, the more expensive it gets, the more power you need, etc., etc. So that's coming. Now, how is that going to be used? The government said at the time that it would be teamed with the Hobart-class destroyers and the future Hunter-class frigates to add more missiles at sea, so more vertical launch capability, right? Acknowledging that with the Hunter-class frigates, we still don't have enough missiles getting to sea. With the general-purpose frigates, they'll probably have about 32 vertical launch cells for missiles. Bearing in mind, a vertical launch cell doesn't necessarily mean 1 missile. This might be a very boring fact, but some missiles are quad-packed, which means 1 can equal 4 missiles. Anyway, it's the point that we need to get more to sea, and we hope that these uncrewed capabilities in the mid-30s might help us do that without having to actually crew them. So we'll see how that goes. It also said that we need about 25 more naval vessels, which is made up of the Australian Border Force ships or patrol boats and the Australian Navy evolved Cape-class patrol boats and the offshore patrol vessels. So you may have heard some stuff about the Arafura offshore patrol vessels. We were meant to be building 12. There has been a lot of criticism of that program. The first one was launched in 2021. It hasn't been commissioned yet. Now, it's not clear. Defence certainly hasn't told us, nor has the government, why it has not been commissioned, but you can read into the fact that if it was launched over 2 years ago, it's not been commissioned. There's probably some safety issues with it, I would suspect. So instead of getting the 12 that we were meant to get, we're going to get 6 of those, which kind of makes sense. It was a bit of an odd, what makes sense to me, an odd capability in terms of it was 1,600 tons, couldn't defend itself, so not good for crisis or conflict, but requires a crew of 40 people. So a bit big for constabulary operations when our average patrol boat that we use for dealing with irregular migration, illegal fishing is 20 people. So it was a bit of an odd ship to fit in. But anyway, we're not getting 12, we're getting 6 of those. Keep moving on, just considering the time. There were some other recommendations in there that talked about we really need to be a little bit more forward-looking in terms of our naval shipbuilding. And so every year, we are apparently going to release a naval shipbuilding plan so defence industry can understand what the plan is. Because one of the criticisms at the moment, and unfortunately the Defence Industrial Strategy that was just released hasn't really helped this, is that whether you're talking about AUKUS or you're talking about future ships, defence industry feel, whether it's true or not, can't say, I'm not defence industry, that they're not getting enough forward lead time on what capabilities defence wants. And even when that happens, we tend to change it. Now that may not be true, but that is certainly the sentiment. Next slide. Okay, so we've talked about what came out of it. There was a bunch more that came out of it, but they're the key things. What are some of the criticisms and challenges? Well, one of the criticisms that came out in the press at the time about expanding the surface combatant fleet was that hang on, ships are really susceptible to uncrewed surface vessels. And if you can see there, at the top of the screen, there is a Russian landing ship, and that is a Ukrainian USV. It's about a 6-meter boat with about 400 kilograms of explosives in the front of it, being remotely controlled, and it's about to hit that ship and sink it. Now, not just one of them, 6, 7 of them. And the way they do that is they take out the propulsion, and then they try and hit something like the engine room, create a secondary explosion, and the ship blows up. Now, there are a lot of people that have said, well, that means that surface ships aren't useful. Well, actually, they've only sunk 2 Russian ships doing this. The Black Sea is also constrained because of the Montreal Convention. Russia can't resupply or refresh its ships. It's also a pretty littoral region. So don't get me wrong, that's an impressive feat, but that doesn't necessarily help us when we're trying to protect that 91% of fuel, the majority of which in an unrefined state comes across the Indian Ocean, right? So yes, there's some lessons from that. It doesn't mean that surface ships are obsolete. We talked about the Hunter and the Arafura, lots of criticism of those 2 projects. And there were some commentators that said, well, hang on, you've got all these ANA reports that talk about this frigate, why are you retaining it? Now, to be honest, if we can deliver what we're saying we're doing, then actually it's going to be 6 pretty good anti-submarine warfare frigates. They're just not great at anti-air warfare or anti-surface warfare, but that's okay. I talked about building in Australia versus overseas. And what are some of the challenges? Well, certainly workforce is a significant challenge, and that has been talked to death. That's both for industry and for the Defence Force, specifically Navy. Now, the Surface Combatant Fleet Review Team said, we've actually done the calculations. With this new plan, you still fit in that trajectory of a Navy of 20,000 by 2040. Feels like creative maths, but maybe, who knows? There's some concern about whether we can sequence it with the AUKUS builds. I would say that this is going to be pretty ambitious for us, but it's actually not, and plenty of people will shoot me down for this, it is not the most amount of ships that we have been building at one time in our history, right? And I mentioned, and I'm not the naval historian, but before World War II, we very quickly built 60 corvettes that we exported, some to the UK, some to India. And so, yes, these are more complex ships. Yes, things are different, but we also have a lot more technology to help us. So I think that, the naysayers that say this isn't achievable, well, there's a lot of risk. That's true. But I do think we need to believe in ourselves and a nation a little bit. The things that I think are the biggest problems with it. 1, the capability gap between now and the late 20s. So I said we had 11 major surface combatants. What the review also said is that HMAS Anzac, the first of the Anzac class, cannot go to sea anymore. Didn't exactly say why, except it's too old. It's predominantly, I suspect, because the amount of money to sustain it is through the roof. And there's probably some workforce wrapped up in that. And then HMAS Arunta, the second of the Anzac class, will be decommissioned in 2 years. So we go from having 11 surface combatants, which 50 years of analysis tells us is not correct, and that doesn't even take into account the current strategic situations, to 9 surface combatants. And when you think about ships, you use a ratio of 1 to 3. So for every 3 ships you can have 1 operational, generally, 1 in training, and 1 under maintenance. Now that ratio becomes more skewed when your ships are old, like your Anzac class. So when we go to 9, we probably have 2 to 3 operational ships at any time. That's a big problem, right? Now, the government has said we're going to start increasing our ship numbers from the late 20s, and that is the fastest we can get them. There is some criticism. Could we build secondhand? Could we bought secondhand ships? There are lots of avenues, but the review team did look at this. So we need to understand what that period of risk is and how we use the rest of the integrated defence force to provide those effects that ships do over that period of vulnerability. And again, if we think about why that period of vulnerability exists, it's because from 2009 and 2000 to 2018, for 9 years, we did not make a decision on how we replace the Anzac class ships. The second thing that I think, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, is a big issue with the Surface Combatant Fleet Review, is it only looked at the surface combatants, right? And when you think about the fact that you need a whole spectrum of maritime capabilities, that is unfortunate. And when you think about the fact that you need to keep coming back to the public and saying, it's $368 billion for nuclear-powered submarines, which it's not, but that's the figure quoted, and it's another $11 billion over the next 10 years for surface combatants, then how do we have the conversation where we're like, we actually need more auxiliaries. We actually need to fix the mine warfare capability. We actually need some sort of capability that could protect underwater submarine cables. Becomes a hard proposition. And so that's where I go to the point that I think that one of our biggest problems, and this is kind of the real crux of my report last year, is we don't have a comprehensive maritime strategy that tells us what do we actually want to achieve in the maritime domain, not just from a naval perspective, but across the spectrum of naval operations through to civil maritime security issues. Now, we do have a civil maritime strategy that was released in 2022, but you can't have a siloed approach to maritime security because it exists on a spectrum. You can't pull off this bit and say, oh, that's how we deal with that. The rest of it, yeah, whatever. Other countries have released maritime strategies. Now, the US has one, India released one in 2015, the UK has one. Countries are increasingly releasing them, but we don't have a comprehensive one, which is how I think we find ourselves in this position where we're like, oh, we need nuclear-powered submarines. Great, we'll go and do that. Oh, we need to expand the surface combatant fleet. We'll go and do that. Now, there's a lot more thought put into it, and I'm not diminishing the Navy leadership in any way, but because we don't have that comprehensive overview of it, we continue to end up in these positions. So that's kind of the 30 minutes that I wanted to go through and allow some time to talk through any of that, if that sparked any questions or anything else to do with, maritime security at the moment. And there is a lot, right? If you saw on the weekend, there is some, next slide, thanks. Didn't nail it on my last one. There's some really kind of confronting footage again over the weekend of a wooden resupply boat from the Philippines heading to Second Thomas Shoal with a very, very high pressure water cannon, basically breaking up the ship. And that's continued to escalate. So there's lots of things we can talk about anyway for the next 30 minutes.
Jennifer, thank you very much indeed. And we will try and get as many questions as we possibly can including those from people who are online. I'll open the batting by just discussing the fact that we know we've got this rotation coming up of both US and RN UK submarines coming through Fremantle. We also know that the first two Hunter-class frigates have been put in the water in Britain, Cardiff and Glasgow. Undoubtedly, we'll have a Hunter-class RN frigate come out here for us to have a look at. What chance do you think there is that we might get a surface combatant capability doing the same thing that our submarines are doing, so that we have at least one or two of our friends, not basing, couldn't use that word, but available very frequently in our ports?
So, this is something actually I think you and Graham wrote on this recently. I don't think it's likely. When you look at the Royal Navy, it actually has just as many, if not more, issues than us. In fact, when we get to 2040, we will be a much bigger Navy than the Royal Navy if they don't change their current course of direction, despite the fact that they have 2 aircraft carriers. So I don't think that they actually have the spare ships to do that. I also think as much as, we talk about the connectivity of Europe and the Indo-Pacific and that European security does depend on Indo-Pacific security, they still have a conflict occurring in Europe, which could escalate. So I don't think we'll see anything beyond the 2 offshore patrol vessels from the Royal Navy that are currently operating out of Singapore. But I do think it's something we should think about. So I do hope we have a piece coming out soon in the AFR that talks about, okay, if we have this period of vulnerability where we have a significantly reduced number of surface combatants between now and the end of the 20s, how do we make the most out of that operational availability? And I would suggest that we look at how do we forward base. And so do we do what the Royal Navy is currently doing, which is basing 2 offshore patrol vessels in Singapore? And do we base one of our frigates out of Singapore, rotate the crews through? I think there's a lot that we need to think about to get the most out of our capability. So I don't think we'll be seeing that, but I think that we should be thinking about it.
Good. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Rosemary at the back. Please say who you are.
Yes, I'm ex-Navy. So, one of the things that really concerns me has always been workforce. But in this case, it's different. I'm talking about the civilian workforce. Shipbuilding requires shipyards and an enormous skilled workforce. Are they possible?
Look,
But I keep talking about this wonderful place in Western Australia that you've got to build. Where is it on Google Maps?
Yep.
And can you actually find it? Where are the trained steel workers then? It just seems to me to be promising something that we don't actually have the physical ability to produce?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and one that comes up. And I think, last week when the UK Defence Secretary visited Australia, and there was a press conference and they actually talked about AUKUS. I can't remember if it was him or our Defence Minister said, but they're right, that the greatest risk to all of these plans, whether it's Surface Combatant Fleet Review, whether it's AUKUS, is the workforce and mainly the defence industry workforce. I think that we need to look at how we can do things differently again in that space. There's a lot of conversation, and I'm certainly not an expert on migration, so I won't touch that, but there is a lot of conversation about how do we use that to solve some of these challenges. But I guess the pleasing thing is, and I'm sure somebody will ask me a question about AUKUS and is it on track or is it not on track? I think with all of these things, one of the good things is at the early stage, we are actually identifying these risks. We are actually hearing the government and industry and defence talk about these risks. They're not saying it's all rosy. And I think if we're talking about these risks early, then we can try and develop policies that can risk mitigate. And so I think that we're in a good space for at least understanding that challenge. Are we going to get there? Look, I don't know, but I think that one of the things that concerns me about the national security debate in Australia, certainly in the last 12 months, is I think that we have framed a lot of our conversations from the negative. So people say, oh, we're going to get these ships. Well, there's all these reasons why we can't achieve it. Well, when you look back at our history, we've stuffed up a lot of projects too. Let's not talk about some of those. But when we look back at our history, we've actually got a lot of history of actually achieving a lot of these things. Now, the key to it is getting the whole of nation engaged in it, and not just talking about this mysterious whole of nation concept, but actually being engaged in it. I think part of that is the government and defence actually having a conversation with the public about where we find ourselves. Like, talking about, oh, we might be in the 1930s, we're not in the 1930s, things like that are unhelpful. But what is actually happening? What is concerning us? And why is this important for us to be encouraging, sons and daughters, etc., to go down this path? I don't think we're having that conversation at the moment. So I guess to directly answer your question, are we going to be able to achieve it and get the workforce sorted? I don't know. But I do think that at least we are starting to think about risk mitigants for that. So I think it's pretty positive, but we'll see. Ask me again in 2040.
Martin's next.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned in your presentation that missile silos, a number, is not the only indicia of lethality of a warship. What are the other factors that might give some confidence that the Hunter class, for example, is a capable warship? Because I understand, if I'm wrong in this, tell me, but I understand the hull of the Hunter and the Hobart is the same. It's just
No.
Okay. Well, in that case, one's hugely more heavier than the other. What have they added to the Hunter that makes it equally as lethal as say, the Hobart class?
Well, I guess when you talk about lethality, you need to think about what domain of naval warfare or maritime warfare are you trying to operate in. And I think that I agree with the assessment that we were not coming up with the capability to get enough missiles to sea. And we're certainly seeing from the Red Sea, for example, you need to have a lot of missiles that you can fit on a ship. Also because we actually can't resupply missiles at sea, which is a huge vulnerability. The US are working on addressing that. Hopefully we will too, but we're not at the moment. But I think about, when you think about the fact that 75% of the world's submarines operate in the Indo-Pacific, and that is continuing to increase, then anti-submarine warfare is pretty important. Now, a lot of people say, well, you don't fight a submarine with a ship, right? But when you're talking about a ship that can detect a submarine outside of its maximum torpedo range, well, then actually potentially you do. And when you think about a ship that could sit and patrol, south of, and sorry if you don't know where these are, I'm sure you will, but, the Lombok Strait or the Sunda Strait, and wait for submarines to come through, because there's only certain ways that submarines can actually get down to Australia from Southeast Asia, then actually you can detect that. And you can have persistence in a ship with a towed array capability to detect those submarines in a way that you can't have persistence with a submarine or P8. So P8 being one of our maritime patrol aircraft, and helicopters that can also hunt submarines. So I do think it's a vital capability. And I think that we become too focused on, well, it's all about missiles and land strike and air warfare. But actually, with 75% of the world's submarines in the Indo-Pacific, it's not all about that. And so having an effective anti-submarine warfare capability is important. People say, oh, but that's why you've got submarines. Submarines are the best hunters of submarines. Well, it actually depends on what else you might want to use that submarine for. Submarines have a lot of tasks, and I wouldn't necessarily be detaching it to just go and hunt another SSN, an SSBN. So an SSBN, i.e. a nuclear carrying submarine, as opposed to a nuclear powered submarine. Yeah, I'd use it for that. But so I think that they do have a role. And I think that those who have ardently argued against that have never operated a towed array system from a ship. So that would be my view. But I would also say, you know, the other ways that you can achieve lethality, mine warfare. So pleasing to see, following the force structure plan in 2020, we are now getting offensive and defensive mines. So if you can mine an area and know where those mines are, but your adversary doesn't, that really changes their calculation for whether they would put a submarine or a ship through there. So I think there is a whole spectrum of naval capabilities that we need to provide lethality. I don't think it's just about missile numbers, although missile numbers are important. And I think that's also one of the problems of our, you know, as I've mentioned, as the Circumvention Fleet Review, is that it didn't look at all of those other enabling capabilities.
Can you double up, oh, sorry, that's supplementary. Can you double up extra missiles in the silos?
And so it depends on the type of missile that you're using. So you have different missiles for different effects. So our Anzac class missiles carry what's called an evolved sea sparrow. So they only have 8 missile silos on them, but they are quad packed. So for every missile silo, you actually have 4 missiles in it. But an evolved sea sparrow is quite a short range point defense missile. If you're looking at something that is a longer range, which we would want to be including in it, so something like an SM2 missile, which has a 90 nautical mile best range to take out another aircraft, then of course you're going to want to prefer that, but you can only fit 1 into your silo. And then you start to talk about anti-ballistic missiles, etc., etc. It's not ideal to have a system where you're relying on a quad pack missile, which is a short point defense.
Yes.
Hi, I was just wondering what your thoughts were on aircraft carriers, like specifically the nuclear powered ones. Do you think that should be something Australia should consider getting, like maybe not nuclear power ones, but just aircraft carriers in general, especially because we're an island nation?
You know, it's really interesting. I think we are an island nation, you're right, and we are so heavily dependent on maritime trade, but we are also only a nation of about 27 million people. And so we need to be a little bit circumspect about the capabilities that we can operate. So Australia used to operate light aircraft carriers. I don't think Australia acquiring some sort of conventional aircraft carriers is ever in our future, for now anyway. And I think that there's a lot of lessons that could be learned from the Royal Navy experience where they have gone through that in the last 10 years. And I would say at the opportunity cost of having a larger number of service combatants that can actually operate. But there are other ways to achieve those effects. And that's again why I think there shouldn't be a review that just looks like a certain type of ship. Because, okay, well, what are the effects you want to achieve with an aircraft carrier? Presence, the ability to conduct land strike, the ability to have significant intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, the ability to achieve air control. Well, there could be a question about, okay, with our LHDs, our large amphibious ships, could you do that with UAVs on them? Could you turn them into a UAV carrier? And in fact, some countries, is it Peru that's just, no. Turkey have just developed what is meant to be kind of a light aircraft carrier that's all about UAVs. I know that Japan is actually turning their kind of equivalent of our LHDs, different ship design, into a light aircraft carrier. So they've been doing trials with the US Marine Corps with short takeoff, vertical landing F-35s. I don't think we'll ever get there, but I think we do need to think about how do we achieve those effects, because certainly they are effects we need to achieve. And, the radius of an F-35, which is our fighter jets, is not far. And unless you can get agreement from countries to our north to base them there, they're not particularly helpful. Would be my argument. I'm not in the Air Force or a fighter jet pilot.
I have here a question from my old friend Chris Skinner, who's watching us online.
Hey, Chris.
Should Australia have contributed a ship to defensive maritime shipping in the Red Sea? For example, an Anzac fitted with CFAR systems and 32 ESSM missiles. One could take a little further and say, rather than an Anzac, should we have sent an air warfare destroyer? That's his question.
Yeah, great question. So I'm on the record of saying in the Australian and on the ABC that I think we should have. And the reason I think we should have is that when we think about, so one of the things I didn't talk about the Defence Strategic Review is it also establishes our primary military area of interest. right, which cuts off in the Indian Ocean at South Asia, effectively, okay? I can see why they've done that, because they've said, hey, we need to have a tighter focus on our, near region. And that makes sense from a land perspective. It doesn't necessarily make sense from a maritime perspective when you think about those sea lines of communication. Now, the Red Sea is obviously the fastest route between Asia and Europe. So I was quoting figures earlier today, can't quite remember, but say 40% of the trade between Asia and Europe goes through the Red Sea, although not anymore. Most of it now goes around Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. So does what the Houthis are doing now impact Australia? Yes, it does, because the EU is in fact our third largest trading partner. Right now, we're really lucky. We're not feeling it in our economy at the moment. The reason we're not feeling it is there actually happens to be a huge global oversupply of shipping, which means that because there is a global oversupply of shipping, any increase in price that is being felt of ships having to spend an extra 10 to 14 days to go around Cape of Good Hope, which is about an extra $1 million in fuel, is actually being sucked up by the ship owners because they're trying to keep their rates down to actually get jobs, right? So it's kind of a unique time that we have this oversupply that we're not feeling it, but we would be feeling it. So I do think that we probably should have, because I do think it is an important waterway for us. I also think it's important to demonstrate to our allies, but also, countries in the region that may be challenging us in the future, and I would put China very much in that boat, that we have the capability to be responsive with our surface combatants. Now, there is obviously a real opportunity cost conversation, because we just talked about the fact that we don't have many. We now effectively have 9, maybe 10. And if you go the rule of threes, we have 3 operational. So it would have had an impact, and it probably would have had the impact of less ships deploying to Southeast Asia. So it is an opportunity cost conversation. I personally would have supported it. But what I thought was concerning is that the justification for not sending one that was given by the government was, well, it's outside our primary military area of interest. It's outside our area of focus. And I thought that was concerning, because it doesn't recognise that actually, if you think about the majority of our unrefined fuel, now it doesn't come from the Red Sea, but it comes across the Indian Ocean. And we can't have this narrow view of this is what matters to us when it comes to the maritime domain.
Good. Another question in the room. Yes, over there.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. After a long period of playing catch up, and as you mentioned, a long period of actually not making decisions, do you feel that now we're in a good position, and we are, strategically better placed? And what are the areas the government should actually be looking at? I mean, is there some new technology that they need to start focusing on as well? A lot of people talk about, drone technology as well. And are you optimistic in what areas do you think that needs to be looked at in the future?
Look, I think my opinion on this might change when we see the National Defence Strategy come out this year. So certainly from the Defence Strategic Review, it was recommended, the government accepted, that we should see a National Defence Strategy come out every 2 years. I personally don't think that is actually a great idea, because of the amount of personnel it takes to develop a public-facing strategy every 2 years, and the amount of politics that gets in place in that. Do I think we are in a good position? I don't. I think that we are in a better position than we were 12 months ago. I have a lot of respect for the team that drafted the Defence Strategic Review and did it in 8 months. I think that's a fantastic achievement. But I still think it was fairly narrowly focused in terms of the challenges we face. Well, not so much the challenges we face, I think it articulated that well, but the things we need to get after. And, I seek in the maritime domain where it talks about ships and submarines, but not all of those other things. I think that we are not communicating with the public effectively, although this has increased, but we're not communicating with the public effectively exactly what the threat is. And we don't really want to talk about it. Well, today it came out that China has been conducting a cyber attack on, is it the Electoral Commission of the UK?
Yes.
Right, for the last 2 years, stealing data, specifically data of MPs that don't support their cause. Now, all countries spy on each other, but that's quite aggressive, right? And when you start to add that up with all of the other things happening, I think we're in a really significant time. Do I think we're going to end up in conflict in the region? I don't think it's probable, but I don't think it's unlikely. And I don't think we're convincing the public of that. So when we do this piecemeal look at strategy or this piecemeal look at capability, $11 billion here, $368 billion there, and we don't really get after the whole package, I think we have a lot of gaps, and it will be hard to convince the public that are experiencing, cost of living challenges, etc., why we need to keep increasing defence budget. In terms of the technologies we're getting after, look, it is actually hard to say in the unclassified space. I'm not inside the room. I certainly know from my time in defence, there were all sorts of interesting things they were pursuing that is not in the public domain. So it's really hard to critique, are we getting after that? But there are some stuff where, things like the Guided Weapons Explosive Ordnance Initiative, not my area of speciality, but we talked about this in the 2020 FSP. It's now 2024, and we haven't really achieved much except some announcements, right? So we do need to be getting after some of those things faster. So I guess a direct answer to your question, I think it's a really concerning time. I don't think that we are doing everything that we need to be doing. And I think the primary thing we need to be doing is talking to the public. I'll give you one more example. So the terms of reference to the Defence Strategic Review talked about looking at the issue of mobilisation, which the FSP, Force Structure Plan 2020, also talked about. The public version of the Defence Strategic Review did not use the term mobilisation, and there has not been a conversation about it since. Now, I understand that there is some preparedness work and things like that going on in government, but you can't talk about issues like mobilisation without explaining to the public what that means and why we're thinking about it.
HH has got a couple of questions here, which I'll roll into one. If one were to compare Australian maritime defence capability and capability with other countries in our region, and a secondary question, and European countries, how do we compare?
So certainly I think we have lagged behind a lot of our region. And I'm not comparing us to, countries like China. I mean, China has massive population, a massive GDP. We will never compare. 2022, they had 340 ships in their Navy, let alone their Coast Guard and their maritime militia. By 2025, they're going to have over 400. By, I think it's 2030, it's upwards of 440, etc. Massively expanding. But when you're looking at the modernization of navies like Japan and Korea, and again, we're not comparable in terms of population, but we are comparable in terms of the expectation of the region in terms of how we support in our capabilities. You look at the modernization of, Indonesia has a lot of issues in terms of their defense funding at the moment, but their modernization plan, if they pull it off, will actually be kind of standfast nuclear submarines, potentially as capable as ours. So I don't think that I think we have been lagging behind the region. I think the Surface Combatant Fleet Review, if we can pull it off, the outcomes of that is an opportunity to catch up. But I think it is a challenge. Now, compared to European navies, we're probably quite a bit ahead because there has been a lot of challenges in terms of investment in defence for European navies. And we're seeing that now come out in terms of, the tit for tat of, and I'm not going to get into this, but like, will Trump be president and will he get rid of every country from NATO or refuse to defend them if they don't have 2% of GDP going towards defence? So they have been underinvesting, but certainly our region has been catching up. And when we talk about the concept of 10-year strategic warning time, a lot of people think that that is just abandoned because, well, actually the chances of a conflict in the region have increased because of China's massive militarization and aggression without transparency. But it's not that. It's actually because we used to have a significant capability gap on most regional countries, and that has been eroded over time because we haven't continued to modernize our Navy.
Yes, right at the back.
All right, thank you. Just want to ask some basic questions. I will looking specific. What's the main strategic purpose, strategic goal of Australian Navy? And in terms of China, we talked about China. To what extent is this round of naval expansion caused by China? If China is going to double down, building up its navy again, do you think our defense review would be very more business?
So I don't. I think, why do we have a Navy? We don't have a Navy because of China. We have a Navy to protect our prosperity, which comes a lot from the maritime domain. That's why we have a Navy. And as I mentioned, we've had a lot of analysis over 50 years that says to do that, we need a bigger Navy. And that is absolutely independent of the strategic circumstances. Now, the reason the government has agreed to the bigger Navy, though, is obviously as a result of the strategic circumstances. I don't think that is as a result of China's military buildup per se. I think it's as a result of their aggressive behavior in the region, which is a different thing. It's not a tit for tat. They've got a new ship, we've got a new ship. We would never compete with that, nor should we. And our strategy isn't to do that. Our strategy is to develop a network, a framework of partnerships and alliances throughout the region to kind of counter that. But, if you look at what has happened in the West Philippine Sea, increasingly over the last 12 months, it's been going on for 20 years, but it has ramped up over the last 12 months. We have sailors from the Philippines being injured. We have a Chinese aircraft in 2022, fighter aircraft flying in front of an Australian P-8 deploying chaff. So chaff are little metal fragments that are used to decoy missiles. There is no reason to do that, except to try and get that chaff into the engine of an Australian P-8, which could have, if not for, the work of that crew, made that P-8 crash and have loss of life. We have a Chinese destroyer sitting Arafura Sea, so just south of the Indonesian archipelago in 2022, that points a military-grade laser through the cockpit of one of our P-8s. We have HMS Toowoomba in the exclusive economic zone of Japan in November last year, where a Chinese ship approached it aggressively. Toowoomba, in accordance with international law, was signaling they were stopped in the water diving, which is a pretty standard thing. You don't send a ship to Southeast Asia without getting nets wrapped around a propeller. And that ship still continued to approach and operate their sonar. There is an aggression there that is concerning. And I think that is why, and you look at the cyber attacks in the UK, the list goes on and on. That is why we are investing in our military capability, in our naval capability, not to match one for one.
I saw another hand up just over there. Yes, sure.
Mick Bryce, just an interested party. You mentioned just 2 months ago, 2%. And it seems to me, if my memory is right, 2% was the figure that was put forward in the 1987 white paper, saying if we spent 2%, we would be looking pretty good. But they never did spend 2%. And so how much would it cost as a first part? How much would it cost today? What percentage of the GDP would it cost to do all of the things that we know about? That's number one. The other thing,
It's an easy question.
The other thing is that, if you look at it slightly differently, we've had 75 years of saving a lot of money by not doing all those things that we might have done if we'd have thought about it more and done anything. Because it seems to me that all the time that I've been interested in strategy, or indeed just a job, because I was in the Navy, that we talked about things. You go to staff college and you talk about this, and all those papers that you've listed that we talk about things. And yet we don't seem to have learned very much. We haven't sort of got to a point where, rather than talk about it, we'll do it. We know how to build ships. I mean, the submarines, greenfield site, ships. Once embarrassed myself by asking the certain captain why the Fremantles didn't have why they had boaters instead of Otto Malera, which he said, well, they were fitted for Otto Malera, but not with, because you don't need a Otto Malera to chase fish up and down the Australian coast. So those sort of things. Are we not fitting? Can we have vessels that were fitted for but not with, crewed for not with, all those strategies, rather than wanted a ship that can do everything, and we're not going to fund it anyway.
I think it's, I guess I'll try and attack some bits of that. So in terms of 2%, I was more talking about that is the NATO expected expenditure. We are actually above 2% GDP right now as of the last budget. So I think we're at about 2.1%. I do personally think that talking about defence expenditure, although I just did, in terms of GDP, is actually a really unhelpful metric. But we are at 2.1. Under the last budget, we were meant to go to 2.3 by 2033. With the new uplift that we're getting for the service combatants, the government saying 2.4. I would hope there's more in the defence budget than just the additional $1.7 billion over the estimates for service combatants. But in terms of how much, you're right. Kim Beazley actually had a piece in the ASPI's Strategist about 6 weeks ago where he talked about if we just followed through with the 87 white paper, I mean, easy to say now, we wouldn't necessarily be in this mess in terms of funding. But you've got to remember too where we were in the early 90s, right? And, there's that famous Francis Fukuyama paper about the end of history. And, there certainly seems to have been
Peace dividend.
Sorry?
The peace dividend.
The peace dividend.
Yes.
A belief that we couldn't possibly face what we had faced before and that the world was changing. Now, we've obviously learned that that is not the case. I think in terms of why are we so reluctant to really articulate what capabilities we need and get after that, I think because, people don't want to believe that we could actually have a conflict in the region. A conflict in this region would be absolutely catastrophic. I mean, 60% of the world's population is in the Indo-Pacific, 60% of the world's GDP comes from the Indo-Pacific. It would be absolutely catastrophic. So people want to believe that that's just not feasible anymore. The problem is there's a lot of indicators to say that might be feasible and that might be what happens. So I think there has been a lot of grappling with, could that actually be the case? And that's a far off probability, that's a fringe argument. We need to be sorting out a lot about issues in Australia, which we have significant issues, whether we're talking about housing, et cetera, et cetera. So I think people didn't necessarily want to believe it. I think we designed a lot of our specifically naval capabilities, as you know, as the fitted for, not with, which kind of came undone with the Anzac class frigates. And we spent a lot of money trying to get them up to an appropriate spec after that. I think moving forward, again, I probably sound like I'm harping on this, and I wrote a piece in the AFR about 2 months ago talking about why is defence not engaged in the defence debate, which is interesting because ministers said, it's because defence should speak more and we're not holding them back, and defence said ministers are holding us back. I think at the moment, the biggest problem is we're not communicating to the public what the real risk is. When Toowoomba had the incident in November last year, it was all over the press and everyone was like, I can't believe this happened. I was like, okay, that's a very unique incident with the sonar, but this happens every day in the South China Sea. The last time I was on a ship in the South China Sea, I was second in command of Successful Darwin, and you couldn't move in the South China Sea without being tailed by a Chinese ship. And if you went anywhere near some of their artificial islands that they have continued to militarize, you would be absolutely harassed. And so I think we're not explaining to the public what is happening and therefore what the risk is. So I think that's the biggest challenge. And then we can talk about how much it would cost. It certainly doesn't cost 2.1 or 2.4% of GDP, right? We know that. And certainly I think we're going to see when the National Defence Strategy comes out. So probably between now and the budget, I don't have any insider knowledge on that, but we are going to see some sort of public-facing IRP. That seems to have been the government's promise since the Defence Strategic Review. And we're going to see a significant amount of defence projects being cut. Because if you go back to the DSR, one of the problems with the DSR was, there's no new money for the next 4 years. Well, hang on. We've just said that this is one of the most dire situations we've found ourselves in for how many years, find your historical reference. And then there's no new money for the next 4 years. So I think that we're going to see more defence projects cut. I think we're going to see more challenges. And I think that the only way to kind of work our way out of this is to have a conversation with the public and have a comprehensive strategy.
We'll have one last question.
Yes,
Yes.
so I'm talking from defence industry, because I think that is part of it. And I think there are a couple of things. Some comments were here around the shipbuilding and the capabilities. I think we have had so many reviews. I mean, you just get cynical when you work in defence industry. So many reviews and changes. And if I look at, the patrol boats, the buttons were actually designed out on request from Navy. They were actually on it before, and now suddenly, because they were thought not to be needed. But okay, that's just one aspect. I think it's if you suddenly send a signal to the workforce, to the suppliers, to the shipyards, that your contract might be just renegotiated. Where is the future for it? Where's the longevity? And when we talk about shipbuilding, it's long term. So at the moment, the signals are, whether it is the Hunter class, whether those are the right ships or not is a different matter, but what signals are we sending? And then on top, and this hasn't been raised yet, and I come from AUKUS from a different perspective, or I want to put a different aspect on it, and that is, in Australia, we don't really have a big defense industry, large companies. We really rely on the primes from overseas. So now there is this signal being sent. If you're not a company that is UK headquartered or US headquartered or a true Australian company, what does that actually mean? Are you excluded or not? So a number of primes that we rely on, or tier 2 or tier 3 companies, are seriously looking, what are we doing? Are we continuing to invest? Where does that leave the military capability in country? We are sending very, very conflicting messages. And I work as strategic advisor to a number of European companies, and I can't tell you how often I get those questions. The decision on the French submarines didn't help, but not only that, it is the cut of the numbers for the vehicles and in other areas as well. And now whether it is the BAE or the Lewison, it's the signals that are being sent. And I'm not quite sure how we are going to face this as a military capability if we send those signals to the fundamental input to capability, whatever that means from an industry perspective.
You want to answer that or take it as a comment?
I'm sorry,
That's all right.
comment.
No, well, I mean, you are more the expert on defence industry than me, so I will perhaps just offer a couple of comments on your first point where you said we keep doing these reviews, and the answer is more reviews, and I agree. But if you look back, so somebody posted something really interesting on Twitter today, and I've declared my hand. I use Twitter, and that's embarrassing. But they posted these quotes for all these things that we need to do, and a photo of the DSR, and they sound like DSR things. And then if you actually read down to the bottom, it's like, yeah, the 1976 white paper really got this right, didn't it? And so I think when you look at a lot of our reviews, back to your point, so sorry, I couldn't remember your name, but we don't actually implement a lot of them. And so, for example, when the current government was the opposition, and they were talking about the fact that we needed a force posture review, I was in force design at the time, and I was like, oh, this is really interesting. Let me pull out the last time Australia did a force posture review, which was, I'll get the year wrong, say it was 2013, 2014, whatever. And when you look at it, and when you look at what you think the recommendations would have been of another one, they're almost exactly the same. We just never actually did them. So we talked about, northern bases and posture and hardening bases. And all this. So we never actually did it. And I think it would be a really interesting study for someone to do a PhD to pull out all of these reviews and look at how much was actually implemented. And I think part of that is the problem because, you look at, I talked about, for 50 years, we've had analysis that said we needed more ships, right? A specific number. And we never actually got after it. Now, obviously, there's opportunity cost and acceptance of risk. In terms of the industry point, look, I'm not an expert on defence industry, but I would agree with you, and certainly that's some of the commentary that I hear. And I was lucky enough to do a Australian Naval Institute webinar last week with Sarah Pavillard from Rejoicer, who talked about a bunch of these issues. And I think that, again, on my point about being clear in terms of the signalling from both government and defence, industry is wrapped up in that, being clear on what we expect, what we need. And certainly, as much as there's a lot of conversation about what the export control legislation might do for countries that are not part of AUKUS, obviously, our naval strike missile that we're getting, called naval strike missile, for example, doesn't come from an AUKUS country, right? So we need to be able to embrace those capabilities and those technologies. But I do think we also need to be careful that we don't stick to a significant plan just because it might upset industry. And I think that the decision to reduce the Hunter from 9 to 6 was an important decision. There's a lot of discussion about should it have been selected in the first place. I don't know. I was not in any of those rooms. I honestly don't know. But if we had progressed with that ship, we would have had the wrong number of ships with the wrong capabilities at the wrong time in a significant geostrategic circumstance. If we had progressed with the Arafura offshore patrol vessel, again, I don't know the problems with that program. I honestly don't. I know that we launched the first one in 21. I know that it was meant to have been commissioned, and it has not. So my assessment would be, and I'm happy for someone to send me an email from the company that runs it and say you're 100% wrong, is that there is some sort of engineering or safety issue, because otherwise there's no other explanation why we haven't commissioned it when we are desperate for ships. So I agree, we need to be clearer on our communication and we need to be sending more signals. But I also think that we shouldn't necessarily stay down a path just because we have committed to it, the whole sunk cost syndrome. And I think we were in danger of doing that with some of our shipbuilding plans.
Now, we're going to have to draw a line under it there. I exercise the chairman's prerogative to make a comment, and mine is by way of a suggestion. Last week, I was at HMAS Cuttable, and I met a delightful young combat information systems sailor. She was obviously Maori, both obviously her physiognomy and also the name on her uniform. And I said to her, how wonderful to see you serving in the RAN. Tell me, did you have to wait 3 years, as I know New Zealanders do have to become Australian citizens before they can apply to join? She said, oh no, I'm a Maori, but I was born in Australia. Lots of my friends in New Zealand would love to come across, but of course they have to wait 3 years, then apply to join, having become Australian citizens. And so, of course, they're deterred from doing so. So if we're thinking about workforce, both civilian and defence, we've got 5 million people just on the other side of the Tasman, many of whom are highly skilled people, many of whom are never going to join the New Zealand Defence Force, not because it's a very good Defence Force, but it's very, very small. Many of them would love a career in the ADF, Army, Navy and Air Force. Many of them have skills which would be ideal for our shipyards and for other places. And we at the moment are still saying, oh, no, you're a foreigner. You can't come across and join us until you have proved that you are a worthy person by doing 3 years something else in Australia. Well, I have news for the Department of Immigration. If you take the NZ out of ANZAC, you don't have a word. There's 5 million potential recruits needed in the defence force and defence industry in this country, many of whom would be ideal, easily integrated, like the Maori Combat Information Systems operator I met the other day. So that's just a suggestion, which I'll be making to Lieutenant General Natasha Fox, who is in charge of all matters to do with personnel when she addresses us at the ADF oration in a couple of weeks' time. Now it's my job on behalf of all of you and those watching online, up there, Chris Skinner and everybody else, to thank Jennifer very much for the level of expertise she's brought to us over this last hour, which represents a lifetime of study. It shows that principal warfare officers can get beyond making things go bang and detecting things underwater, on the surface and in the air, and think strategically about how the capability that during her service life she has used and understood can be used for the national good. Please thank Jennifer very much.